Hi, my name is Gil Robertson, president of the African American Film Critics Association. Today, we are talking to the creatives responsible for BMF. We're going to kick things off by introducing you to the African members on the call today, beginning with Nancy Green in Baltimore, DJ Chris Stiles in Cleveland, Ohio, Jill Monroe in Los Angeles, Rhonda Rasha Penrice in Atlanta, and Dana Abercrombie in New York. I'm going to let you guys do what you do so well, and I will see you on the other side.
Hello, Dana Abercrombie from the Coalition. My question for both of you is, this is viewed kind of as a companion piece to BMF, but what was it that was really important that you wanted to separate from the docuseries from the TV show?
Thanks for the question. Hi, I'm Shan Nicholson, the series showrunner. Well, this was the entire story of BMF. As opposed to starting the early days in Detroit, we were assigned to do the entire rise and fall of the BMF story, and which was huge challenge, especially with as many characters and it's a 20-year story plus, starting from Detroit, ending in Atlanta. But yeah, that was the initial. That's what I would say the big difference is this is the entire story as opposed to the early years in Detroit.
Yeah, Chris Dowles from WOVU 95.9 FM in Cleveland. This story is so fascinating because we're talking about an organization that spread it for during the time they hiked from 2000 to 2005. And then we saw the height of Atlanta music. We saw the height of the hip hop community go big. How going through those stories and you see how it's connected to hip hop, what was the most fascinating story that you got out of it when you're just speaking off camera to the people that was involved with BMF?
Well, I think from a broader perspective, as the interconnection with hip hop and Atlanta becoming this cultural mecca, as we call it, was just so interesting to see how a criminal organization really reshaped a city and provided a piece in the foundation for this sort of Atlantan cultural renaissance. Like they were part and parcel of the building blocks, from my perspective, of what made Atlanta become essentially, for lack of a better terminology, like this new Motown and this place that that people would flock to. And so there's a lot of kind of off-camera conversations with dancers and people who ran small businesses who just talked about living through that experience and how it transformed not only the spaces around them, but their own personal lives and their own sort of like outlook and motivations for the future, just having this presence in their city.
Hi, Jill Monroe, Access to the Life. So with a story like this that deals with indictments and jail time and lots of people that have gone through various parts of the criminal process, how do you walk that legal line? How do you make your participants feel comfortable that something won't trigger something else, or that they are, safe in discussing and sharing some aspects of these stories?
Well, I mean, all of the plot points that we unveil have all been sort of adjudicated. So in essence, no one can really get in trouble for talking about how they participated. I mean, a lot of these guys are kind of now just coming out of prison and willing to share their stories. A lot of it is a trust issue, and we were able to really build a lot of trust with Meech and the Flannery family, it was a sort of a process to kind of open up and be able to share stories. And a lot of folks would clam up when the camera comes on, of course, but it takes some easing of the tension and just, you know, some coaxing to get the rhythm of the interview, and it everybody, you know, saw the value of this story, you know, and saw the value of being able to share, you know, their story and their participation with BMF, and you know, it's an American story, you know, it's their version of the American dream, and it's a boy to king story in a lot of ways, and Meech just has this essence about him that really, you know, just people gravitated towards him. I mean, the first, you know, few times that I talked to him on the phone, I was just like, oh, I get it. This guy's a natural born leader, and you know, I would follow him. You know, he was like immediately an instant big brother to me, and it was just really it was just amazing to be that connected and that close to the inner circle of this organization, and yeah, I'm glad they were very open to tell their story.
Hi, my name is Nancy Green with Film Critique. And I wanted to say, I found this really fascinating. There's a lot of things about this that I didn't know. And one of the things that I found very, very interesting was the fact that he was able to create this sort of organization where people didn't fight. They weren't really getting into a lot of different things. And so I wanted to know now, with like the popularity of things like marijuana being legalized, and you hear like a lot of harder drugs, they're doing microdosing to try and make it more popular, talking about legalizing some of these things. What do you think this documentary says in terms of the argument for legalizing drugs versus you know, the harm that it can sometimes cause families in terms of the people that use it and become addicted?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm sure, Chris, you have some ideas behind this as well, but I mean, I think you know, we wanted to sort of take a critical look at the war on drugs and you know, its failures, essentially. You know, I mean, this chronicles, you know, from the early 80s in the crack era all the way, you know, to the 2000s, you know, when the opioid epidemic really kind of took off, and it's kind of an interesting crisscross where BMF was down, the opioid crisis was starting. And you know, I think it's important to look at the bigger picture in this case. You know, Meech and Terry ran an organization like a Fortune 500 company. It was because the idea, you know, that they came from a very sort of poor background and were able to rise up and be able to, you know, organize and run their organization like I said, like a Fortune 500 company. I mean, in any other circumstances, they would have been, you know, leaders of industry, and it's a lot of the systematic, you know, changes that the country was going through because of the war on drugs that sort of set them back and apart. So yeah, I mean, that was our intention from the very beginning, was to sort of have a critical look at the America's war on drugs and its failures.
And to sort of piggyback or add to that, I think that, you know, where they came from, the city that they came from at the time, I think it's really important to note that that Flannery's moved to Detroit, like as the door was shutting on Detroit being the land of opportunity for millions and millions of Black people, as it had been for the previous 50 years, sort of leaving them, you know, the culture of work and success and all that was sort of evaporated, and in its place was this new industry, the street industry. I think that the culture of that city and the work ethic, they, like Shan said, if those businesses and those were still around and the plants were still open, they could have gone left and been something else, but they took where they were from and capitalized on the thing that was available, which, you know, has obviously negative consequences for, you know, a lot of people. But I do think that they measured that in a lot of different ways.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was definitely one of the things that I found the most striking about it, because you know, as you talk about the popularity of drugs now and the legalization, it's just tragic how many lives were destroyed just for us to get to this point. So thank you.
Hi, Kathy Woods, the Philadelphia Tribune and Couple Social. My question is, you know, we always talk about the cause and effect of, you know, why people do what they do. Can you talk a little bit about, you started a little bit about the things that are going on financially and economically in the city of Detroit, how the car industry being taken out of that city. I have in my family, there are 4 people who retired over General Motors, and how they were able to buy a house and get a brand new car every year and put their kids through college and all of that. Can you talk about how we don't talk enough about how government taking those jobs overseas has had a very harsh effect on the inner city?
Yeah, I think that as sort of in Detroit specifically, you know, foundationally, it was a place where there was opportunity if you were to put in that work, and communities and everything was sort of based around this idea. And so when an idea just is gone, you know, through a confluence of different factors, obviously the industrialization, the car industry, the uprisings or riots or whatever you like to call them, you have, you know, Black leadership taking hold in a city, in a Republican controlled federal sort of system. So it's like a perfect storm of things that foster an environment in which I think is kind of unique to the Flannerys and the Detroit sort of situation, because if you know the mentality for generations is like, I do this, this is the end result, automatic, it's just gone. And then instead is something very dangerous that's absorbing the community. I think that it's a very, I would imagine, a very difficult place to navigate.
It's also, Detroit was a very, you know, I've heard this through, you know, talking to a lot of the Detroit, you know, early mentors of Meech and, you know, the early sort of the hustlers that were around at that time. Detroit, you know, there's an industriousness about, if that's a word, there's an, you know, the way that that Motown build their records, it's the same way that they build cars, right? So, I mean, selling drugs, you had, you know, groups like YBI and Pony Down Gang and all of these other sort of organizations that really made it like an industry, right? You had your hierarchy, you had a way of doing things that were very different than other cities. You know, there were little pockets of drug dealers, you know, in New York and that ran smaller crews, but in Detroit, it was you know, it was, I mean, New Jack City is a perfect example, was built off of the Chambers brothers, you know, the story of the Chambers brothers. And it was just this sort of doing it on an industrial size kind of, you know, and I think the Flannery brothers were, you know, young entrepreneurial, you know, spirits that saw this happening and we're like, okay, how do we do our take on it? Well, let's take this nationally. And, you know, I think that was sort of something that is built into the fabric of Detroit, this sort of entrepreneurial spirit and this this way of doing it bigger and better, for lack of better terms.
In operating like a business, operating like, you know, we talk about how the lack of, you know, the cohesion that was sort of built, you know, we have different gangs in BMF from warring gangs from different parts of the country and this, that, the other thing, the franchising and all of those ideas stem from, you know, the culture of that city, in my opinion. And just being kind of like for being about your business and putting ego to the side a little bit because it doesn't do good. It doesn't do anything for the greater good. You know, if people are always fighting in the auto plant, like you're not going to build any cars.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that was and they were kind of coming up at a perfect time too, where all of these gangs were imploding, you know, all of their previous mentors, like the YBIs and the Pony Down gangs, you know, because of violence, essentially, you know, the Demetrius Holloways and the Maserati Ricks, were all being sort of killed or sent to jail, and they were sort of, you know, in the distance looking at this and saying, well, violence is definitely not the answer here. You know, this is not about, you know, they're about making money and not about being the toughest guy on the block, you know? So I think that's kind of what set them apart as well.
Hey, it's Rhonda. I actually live in Atlanta, so I was here during the BMF years. But as you talked about what were the factors in Detroit, what were the factors in Atlanta that, you know, made it home base of a national operation?
I mean, I personally think that Atlanta, the city of Atlanta has long been a place of opportunity since the 50s for Black entrepreneurs to sort of feel that they can do things in a way and navigate city legally, politically, illegally, that you can't really in places like Detroit or Chicago or Memphis or that. So I think that moving to Atlanta, their move to Atlanta is part of the whole the Mecca idea of the city as we know it now. It's a place where, as a Black person, there's a feeling of freedom, and this is just from my personal experience, that doesn't exist in northern cities. That you can move about a little bit more freely because there's people around you in different industries and walks of life that look exactly like you. I find the city very unique in that way. And I think, you know, I believe, Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, that, like, you know, one of the things that Mitra, one of them says, like, you can have flashy cars in Atlanta, like, but I know you can't be driving around in Detroit with, you know, that kind of stuff. You will be stopped because you're not supposed to have it. In Atlanta, it's okay to have it.
Yeah, he says that and I remember in the film, he says something to the effect of, you know, you in Atlanta, you could buy $400,000 houses and, you know, nobody would blink an eye. But in Detroit, if you move to the suburbs, you're going to go to jail. So I think there was just a different sort of lens, you know, that, you know, and also I think he was really attracted to the social and party scene of Atlanta. You know, this was at a time where, you know, Freaknik was going off and nightclubs were, you know, going on all night and all day. and I think, you know, he was like, wait, I could floss, I could be free and you know, not be harassed by police. And I think, you know, he took to the city immediately.
Dana Abercrombie again. What I was wondering is, can you talk about the balance between the entrepreneurial spirit that affected other people's businesses, but also the negative impact that they had? How do you balance that in this documentary to show both sides kind of equally?
I'm sorry, what can you phrase that question again?
I was talking about during the development of this series, can you talk about balancing both the entrepreneurial spirit, because they rebuilt up Detroit, but also at the same time, many lives were affected negatively.
I mean, I think that none of the participants in the film, Meech included, have any sort of notions that this was a business that is built upon the pain of a lot of people, and that's just the part of that trade. And so I don't think that there's any sort of like them denying it. And I've always thought perhaps like that was one of the reasons, being conscious of that fact that they were generous and became these aspirational figures in sort of transforming a part of Atlanta, or Atlanta for some people. That's just my personal opinion. But I don't think they had any notion that what they were doing wasn't damaging in some way, shape, or form.
Hi, Nancy again. One of the things that I wanted to know in terms of the documentary and putting it together is, what are some of the things that you had to leave out just because of maybe some of well, I don't want to say some of the information that was in there, but just for time and for other things concerning keeping everything together that you think should have gone in?
Personally, I think, it was, I mean, we had 8 episodes, so we could cover a lot. But, with an organization this big, the tentacles just go far and far and wide. Terry's story is a big part of BMF, and he is absolutely featured in this documentary. But because of his case and because of his situation, he couldn't really participate as much as we'd like. And so we hear a lot of Meech in the documentary, not as much from Terry personally. And they at some point did sort of split part ways, and we kind of follow Meech and his journey more, and I think it could have been a little bit more balanced with a little bit more Terry. But I mean, it's still probably the most comprehensive documentary you're going to you're going to be able to see on on BMF, especially hearing it from Meech's mouth firsthand. Like he walks us through very intimate moments in his life, from having a son to being shot to the ups and downs of his journey. It is probably the most comprehensive look at BMF sort of ever taken.
I mean, I kind of agree with Shannon. It's like throughout the process, it's like, oh, I wonder what sort of Terry's take on it, because it is the two of them. And then I sort of came to this, like in this weird sort of meta way, it's representative kind of them when they were active. It's like Meech is kind of like the upfront guy, and we know Terry's somewhere with an opinion lurking in the shadows to a certain extent. But when doing things like this, I think there's always little things that you wish that the babies and things that can mean a lot to you that that don't end up making, because they don't make sense except for in your head.
Yeah, I mean, there's dozens of like smaller stories that from all of our different characters. I mean, that's the thing, is that everybody in the inner circle of BMF, they all have extraordinary stories on their own, and them sort of all converging into this one organization was this sort of force. I mean, it was almost like flies, moths drawn to a flame, and Meech was that flame. He really was, and speaking to him again, I all I could say is that he just had that natural ability to lead. He was and is very charismatic, and I could see why I mean, I understood why he was the main thrust of our series, and why he is the legend that he is.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Hi, Jill Monroe again. So I want to talk to you about the investigators and the law enforcement participated in the project. They seem to have almost a fondness in some ways for Meech and the different characters, in how they conducted their business and kind of led them on the chase and so forth. So can you talk to me about the process of bringing them in to participate and their willingness to sort of open up how they handled this case and what they did admire about their subjects and that?
Yeah, it was the same way, we had to build trust on the BMF side. We absolutely had to build trust on the law enforcement side as well, and because a lot of folks were hesitant to participate just because BMF is celebrated, and they're a criminal organization, and they're like, well, what is this going to be another fluff piece on BMF, like, or is this going to be a sort of look at the real story? And we had to sort of essentially assure them that this was the deep dive. We wanted to hear the ups and downs and sort of everything in between. And once you sort of, it's a close club, in a brotherhood and a bond that is formed with law enforcement when they bring down an organization this big. You know, a lot of these folks, you know, haven't seen each other for 10, 15 years, but you know, that bond and that friendship is really, so if you get the trust of one, especially somebody like Jack Harvey, and they vouch for you, then it's easy to sort of like, well, you should talk to this person, you should talk to that person. Then it becomes like a sort of domino effect where, you know, we're you know, we can get the sort of fuller picture. I mean, we were able to get the sort of key figures. There were others sort of, you know, from Detroit. This was a massive case. You know, this was a huge conspiracy. You know, this spanned across the entire country. There were dozens and dozens of participants on the BMF side, and dozens of law enforcement agencies, you know, that were responsible for finally taking them down. So we had to pick and choose who our main characters were, and from my point of view, Jack Harvey stood out as you know, the sort of main character on the law enforcement side, since he, you know, BMF was, you know, he was Captain Ahab and BMF was his Moby Dick. You know, nobody believed in it, that you know, nobody believed in this case. People kept passing and finally, you know, Rand Sheehy and others really sort of kind of, you know, saw how they were affecting, you know, Atlanta and got involved. But, you know, it's a hard case. You know, conspiracy cases are always really kind of interesting because it's not necessarily always a smoking gun. In fact, it never is. It's little pieces of evidence that are built throughout time, a timeline, and we sort of demonstrate this in the series where, you know, there's corkboards with, you know, pictures and lines connecting to different, you know, crimes, and it's really a complicated case. There was no sort of, you know, Meach was never caught on wiretaps or you know, pictures with, you know, selling drugs. Terry was caught on wiretaps, but, you know, there was this whole umbrella of activity that was happening. Umbrella is probably the wrong word, but this web of activity that was happening around them that they had to sort of pin back to Meach and Terry, which was, you know, it took years. It took years and years and years. And so, yeah, so building that trust. And again, you know, the thing about most drug organizations, we kind of talk about this in the doc, is that, you know, most drug organizations, you take power by violence. You know, that's essentially kind of from the Italian mafia to the cartels, you know, to other drug organizations. Violence is the key and the tool in which most organizations yield to take business or to take over territory or what have you. You know, Meach and Terry, you know, they used diplomacy. They used logic. You know, they're like, we're going to sell it for cheaper. And so you're going to want, you know, you're going to want to get it from us. And if you steal from us, well, then you're cut off the line. You know what I mean? It's not about killing you, or it's not about, it's more about diplomacy. And I think that, to me, that's what drew me to the story. It wasn't just a typical, you know, quote unquote drug organization. They did things differently. And I think law enforcement, although they understood that it was illegal, they had a sort of certain respect for the way that they did business. You know, they had an understanding that this was about money and it wasn't about, you know, about violence. And I think that they understood that, and they understood that, you know, it was a big task to organize this many people across the country, and you know, they were very clever, you know, in how they did their business and how they kept under the radar for many years. I mean, at one point, I think they were responsible for 60% of the cocaine coming into America, which is, you know, unheard of, you know, for you know, an organization that 60%. I mean, if you think about it, it's staggering, and that it was, you know, one organization.
I also appreciate that some of the characters on the law enforcement side, with the Wire reference in there, did kind of remind you of those archetypes, and it was just real. So just goes to
it's art imitating life, imitating art again. You know, this whole they were using The Wire or watching The Wire. There was amazing stories coming from both sides.
Thank you.
My question for both of you is, what is your takeaway? Because we have people who study BMF and aspire to be BMF, not thinking the end picture is they've been in jail for over like Meech is still in jail, right? And what do we say to our young people? Because we do have that void of showing the legitimacy of running a business and getting that type of money. But how do you balance that in saying, hey, yes, they had moments and it was cool and all of that, but this is where they ended up. Be very specific and pay attention that, there is no retirement plan for drug dealers. You either are dead or you're in the penitentiary. That's it. There's no in between. So how do you balance that with people not looking at this and being like, cool, I want to aspire to be that?
Well, I think one thing just that came to my mind immediately, and I'll give it to you, Shannon, is like, when we hear Meech, it's clear where Meech is. When at the start of all these episodes, this is a man who's incarcerated. And this is clearly something that happened, 20 years ago. So the end result, kind of hearing that voice, hearing that prison voice is to me a little bit more effective than, someone who had passed away from this. You as a viewer, I take away a little bit the like, this is what you end up with. You are in jail, which is not a place that most people aim to be. But I understand what you're saying. It is tricky because of all of the fun highlight times and whatnot. But near the end in the last couple episodes, it's discussed how Meech knew like there is several characters, like there's no retirement plan for this. Like there's no, you're either in the graveyard or it's a common phrase, but they say that like, you're going to go to jail if you get involved with this eventually. And when you really look at it, their run, the Atlanta run, the celebratory run wasn't like a super long period of time. But it is stuff of lore. So I see both sides.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Chris is saying, it was my decision from the, hearing Meech's voice, especially coming from a federal penitentiary, I was struggling with opening the show with it just because it could have been a cool device to sort of pay off later, if we kind of kept that from the audience and like, it paid it off later. But, hearing him at the very beginning, the very opening of the show, tell his own story, it is a stark reminder that this is coming from a federal penitentiary. This call is coming from a federal penitentiary, which grounds the whole series in reality. This isn't a fantasy. This is the true story. This is where, this is where the story ends. It's in a penitentiary. And throughout the whole, throughout every episode, we do show this sort of arc, right? And there's almost always, something that is a negative consequence from selling drugs, whether being shot or being, part of, or multiple shootings, there's colleagues going to jail or dying. This is not a fun game to play if you're not built for it. And again, trying to take a look at the bigger picture, and kind of pulling the camera out 5,000 feet, as they say, and look at the whole picture. It should be looked at as a bit, the bigger study on the American dream and how drugs and drug dealing, kind of plays a part in the fabric of this country, because this is a story that's nothing. There's not really anything new to the story. It's a story that's been told before. However, how they perceived their version of the American dream was very different, and how they went about getting it was very different. And so, gosh, now I think I'm talking in circles, but my point is, I think it's like, there's always a balance. We were always trying to strike a balance between, what they did that was sort of quote unquote cool and you know, for for kids, and then, you know, what the consequences are. And then, you know, Meech is a very complicated, and what I loved about this project the most was, you know, Meech is a very tragic character. You know, it's almost like the scorpion and the frog. He has to shine. He has to, he exudes you know, confidence and you know, opulence, but it's that same characteristic that takes him down at the, you know, at the end. And I think that's sort of that thin line that we're trying to express and trying to show with this documentary. And you know, hearing from his colleagues and from himself how you know, it all kind of transpired is fascinating for me to hear, you know. And it was a process as we were, you know, interviewing and editing to find, oh, okay, this is a thread that we can actually follow. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It does. Thank you so much, guys.
Hey guys, how central is 50 Cent's involvement in getting this done?
well, this piggybacks the BMF series, the scripted series, and you know, he from day one, he was very much involved in the creative process, you know, right down to the music that's being, you know, he's very hands-on, and you know, he has a very, you know, his strong connection with Little Meech, Big Meech, and Terry, and so, you know, he was the one that sort of brought it all together, and it, you know, brought us together with the Flannery family and everything.
Christopher, Shannon, thank you so much for your time today. On
Thank
behalf
you.
of the world's largest group of Black film and TV critics, we thank you for joining us for this edition of AAFCA Roundtables. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.